Here's what you need to know about the Panasonic Lumix S5iiX. Now the S5iiX was announced around the exact same time as the S5II. Only the difference between the cameras is the S5iiX is a hybrid camera that's been designed to be better built for more videographer needs. It has a number of features and codecs in it that lean very heavily towards an industry standard for videography. So if you're a videographer looking to hit on that professional level, then the Panasonic Lumix S5iiX is a good camera to get. So the S5iiX is of course naturally going to be a bit more expensive than its previous model, what with having all these extra new features. So today I'm going to be covering a number of features of this camera, so stay tuned. Now, the most immediately obvious thing about this camera when compared to its predecessor is the design. The cameras are almost identical in terms of layout and build, but the coloring is completely different. The S5iiX has a more monochrome design, meaning all the buttons that were originally white are being turned into a sort of darkish grey. And the logo on the front, the Lumix here, is also pitch black. Now the only bit of colour on this camera besides whatever lens you might be using is the little red button here on the camera. Another benefit of this discrete design is it doesn't show up as much in reflections. Now some photographers and videographers will often have to cover up the logos with black tape so they don't necessarily have that bit of white showing up in any reflections in their shots. And in addition to that, they've also got their own vari-angle screens, so that's always welcome. Now despite this camera having more features than the S5II, it is actually the same weight, weighing only 740 grams. But some actually prefer the design of the S5II in comparison to the S5iiX. So let me know which design you prefer and why in the comments below. Now within this camera you have a new codec to the Panasonic Lumix series, ProRes. Now for those of you that don't know what ProRes is, it's a high quality form of video compression designed for higher resolutions such as 4K, 6K and 8K resolutions. This codec has since become the industry standard among many post-production and videography workflows. So if you are looking to get into the industry, this is a good codec to reach for. Now there are actually quite a few different types of ProRes. So specifically in this camera, you're getting the ProRes 422 HQ. Although that's only when using external SSD drives, which we'll talk about later in the video. But internally, this camera records at ProRes 422. So if you want a lot of rich colors in your shots, then ProRes is definitely the codec you should be looking at. One setback with ProRes though is it is much larger than H.264 or H.265 codecs, so do factor that in when shooting in ProRes. Now while this camera can shoot in very high resolutions in ProRes, which we'll get into, it is restricted to HD at 25 frames per second internally. But there is a workaround to this, as Panasonic Lumix has also implemented an all-new feature, the S5II series, which enables you to shoot at ProRes at up to 5.8K. Now this camera has external SSD recording capability, which is utilized via the USB-C port on the side here. Now the benefit to using an SSD drive as opposed to SD cards is that an SSD drive is typically much larger and can fit a lot more on it. So you're keeping a lot more of what your content that you're shooting within one single drive, as opposed to having to swap out to a whole bunch of different cards. And given that you will be shooting in this camera in very high resolutions and large file formats, you do want a fairly hefty bit of memory attached to this camera. And another benefit of an SSD drive is that given that they're much larger than an SD card, you're less likely to lose them, as now you've got this little tiny brick that isn't necessarily bulky to carry around. Another thing to note about an SSD drive is it does mean that you have a more universal port in the form of the USB-C port. All in all, an SSD drive is cleaner and much more efficient to work with. But let's get into the big benefit of an SSD drive for this camera in particular. Now, as I noted, the ProRes is limited to HD internally on this camera, but once you plug the SSD drive into this camera, it significantly ups the quality of all your footage in this camera, because now you're able to record at 5.8K 422 ProRes. This camera can shoot up to 6K at 25p on the MOV codec and up to 5.8K at 25p in ProRes. The sensor in this camera is a 24.2 megapixel sensor that works great in low light situations. as this sensor has 2 base ISOs. The benefit of shooting in 6K is it now gives you much more room in post-production, as now you can apply post-production pans and tracks to your footage, as well as adjust the stabilization on your shot. This is because there's more pixels in the sensor, which means there's more information in every shot that you're taking. The S5iiX also has external RAW output. This means that you have an external monitor such as the Atom S5, you are able to record in RAW via output. Now the advantage of shooting RAW is it is a lossless form of footage that maintains all the information that the camera has processed, with zero color grading or any sort of camera magic to make the shot look good. This does mean that the footage is going to be very washed out and flat looking. Don't worry though, all the information is there in your footage. It just needs to be pulled out via post-production effects. Now the advantage of RAW is something you'll notice in post-production, as now you can better adjust the brightness of the image, the highlights, the shadows, the white balance, and have more flexibility and control over your footage. This camera also has direct streaming capabilities, meaning you can plug this camera in and sync it up to any device that is streaming. This is great if you want additional cameras for your streaming setup. Now, if you do want to set this camera up for streaming, there are a few ways to go about it. A more cordless way is you can link this camera up by the Lumix Sync app, which will get you there much quicker. You can also utilize the USB-C port in the side here and plug your camera directly in to your streaming device. Another thing to note is if you have a USB-C to Ethernet adapter cable, you can plug your Ethernet cable into this camera and again, link it directly into your device. And if you're worried about how this camera might look without any post-production work and coming directly out of the camera, fortunately this camera does enable internal LUTs, meaning you can set a specific look and color grade to your shot and stream with that. Now for all you photographers out there, this camera also has something very special in the form of live view compositing. Now if you're a photographer who enjoys doing long exposure photography, typically what you might find with long exposure is you kind of have to guess the exact moment when to release the shutter button, and then you get shown the result of your shots. But fortunately with this camera, with its live view compositing, you're able to see the image get processed in real time and really nail that precise moment to let go of the shutter button and get your perfect shot. Now this camera combines a number of different autofocuses to really up the quality of the autofocus in this camera. It combines contrast autofocus, phase detect autofocus, along with a number of AI algorithms inside the camera. Combining this all together gives your camera significant improvement in terms of subject detection and tracking. On contrast autofocus alone, this camera would struggle to shoot in lower contrast situations or slower shutter speeds. But with phase detection, you're able to ensure that whatever shortcomings the contrast autofocus might have, the phase detection will pick up on. Of course, the tracking is very simple. You simply set it to tracking and then press on the object that you want to track, and the autofocus will lock onto it. Now, this autofocus will break if you do have a very big object move directly in front of the screen and completely change the frame. But provided your object is maintained in the frame, the tracking is very efficient and reliable. Now, this doesn't get talked about a lot with this camera, but I think it's worth mentioning as this is a camera that is geared strongly towards videographers. Now, within this camera, you can change the frequencies to NTSC, which is 23.97 frames per second, or PAL, which is 25 frames per second. But if you've ever had to shoot at 25 frames per second, you might notice it just looks a little bit off, especially if you want to shoot in a more cinematic look. And NTSC at 23.97 isn't quite 24 frames. But fortunately in this camera, you have a third frequency, which is called cinema, and this shoots at true 24 frames per second. This means that it's not 23.97, it's exactly 24 frames per second, meaning that if you want to shoot your footage and have it look a bit more like those cinematic movies you've been growing up with or currently watching, you can with this camera. All in all, this camera is a very good base if you plan to get into videography with Panasonic Lumix. It does of course require additional bits of equipment to really get the most out of it, but that is going to be a standard if you're getting into videography. Let me know what you think about this camera in the comments below.